Have you ever felt like your prayers hit the ceiling and fall back down? Imagine standing in a dry land where the sky is closed and the ground is cracked. And with just one prayer, the heavens open and rain pours down. This is not just a story about a prophet, but a reminder that God still hears, and Christ still calls us to a life set apart. Welcome to Midnight Psalms, a place where we dive deep into the stories of faith, hope, and the calling of Christ for our lives. Here you'll not only hear about ancient prophets, but also discover how their journeys point us to Jesus, who calls us to holiness and to live with hearts dedicated to Him. The prophet Elijah walked into a world torn apart by idolatry and rebellion, a place where people had forgotten the living God and had chosen to bow before powerless idols. The skies were shut, no rain fell, and the land was dying. Yet Elijah knew something that the crowd had forgotten. The God of Israel was alive, sovereign, and holy. Holiness is not about perfection in human effort, but about separation, being set apart for God's purposes. Christ would later teach us that holiness is impossible by our own strength, but possible through His sacrifice, because He cleanses not only what we do but who we are. When Elijah prayed for rain, he wasn't just asking for water. He was aligning his heart with God's will, showing us that holiness begins in the soul, where Christ plants His life in us. Holiness is not a heavy burden meant to crush us. It is the response of a heart that realizes it was made for something greater than this world. When Christ said, "Be holy for I am holy," He wasn't commanding the impossible. He was inviting us into the reality of being His, of carrying His light within us. Elijah's prayer for rain after years of drought reflects this same truth. Only when we turn back to God, acknowledging His power and surrendering our will, can the skies open over our lives. The prophet's persistence shows us that holiness is not about never failing but about always returning to God, always believing that His grace is stronger than our weakness. Christ cares deeply for our souls because they are eternal, and in Him, our souls find life that never runs dry. Think about it. The people of Israel were desperate, but they had been feeding their desperation with false gods. They were thirsty, but they were drinking from broken cisterns. Elijah stands as a mirror for us today. How many times do we run after things that cannot satisfy, while neglecting the one who alone gives living water? Christ Himself said, "Whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst." That's the heart of holiness, not running after empty promises, but being satisfied in Christ, who fills the soul. When the rain came down after Elijah's prayer, it was a sign that God had not abandoned His people. In the same way, when Christ fills us with His Spirit, it's proof that He has not abandoned us but calls us to live in His presence daily. Elijah's prayer wasn't casual, it was desperate, persistent, and deeply rooted in faith. He bowed low, placed his face between his knees, and cried out again and again until the servant finally saw a small cloud rising over the sea. That image is powerful. Holiness doesn't happen instantly but through daily surrender, daily repentance, daily turning our hearts back to Christ. We don't become holy because we check off religious boxes, but because we lean on Christ's strength, admitting our weakness. The same Christ who died on the cross knows the fragility of your soul and treasures it. To Him, your heart is worth more than the entire world. And when you pray in alignment with His will, even the smallest cloud of hope can become a downpour of grace over your life. Holiness can sound intimidating, like a mountain too high to climb. But the beauty of the gospel is that Christ climbs with us, carries us, and transforms us from within. Elijah didn't bring the rain by his own power. He prayed, trusted, and waited on God. In the same way, Christ is not asking you to manufacture holiness. He's asking you to abide in Him, to let His Spirit do the work in your soul. Your soul is the most valuable treasure you have, not your job, not your possessions, not even your reputation, and Christ guards it with His own life. This is why He calls you to holiness, because He desires your soul to live, not to wither like the land in drought. And when we walk with Him, even the deserts of our lives can bloom again. Elijah's story reminds us that God delights in answering the prayers of His people when they are aligned with His purposes. But notice something crucial. Before the rain fell, Elijah rebuilt the altar of the Lord. Holiness starts there, at the altar of surrender, where we lay down our idols and return to the one true God. For us, that altar is the cross of Christ, where every broken piece of our lives can be restored. When we live near the cross, holiness is no longer a distant command but a daily reality, because the Spirit of Christ shapes us into His likeness. Your soul is safe in His hands, and holiness becomes a joy, not a weight. If we're honest, many of us have felt dry seasons when our prayers feel unanswered and our hearts feel far from God. Elijah's story proves that God can turn drought into abundance in a moment. But the call of Christ is not only to seek rain when we're desperate. It's to walk daily in holiness, guarding the soul he redeemed. Holiness is not perfectionism, it's direction, moving closer to Christ even when we stumble. And when we realize that Christ cares more about our soul than our circumstances, our perspective shifts. We stop asking only for rain and begin asking for the living water that changes us from the inside out. Holiness is also relational. It's not about isolating ourselves from the world but about shining the light of Christ within it. Elijah was one man, but his prayer touched an entire nation. In the same way, your pursuit of holiness impacts not just you but your family, your friends, your community. Christ calls us to live holy because he desires his presence to flow through us to others. When you choose to guard your soul, to seek him above all else, you become a channel of grace just as Elijah became a channel for rain. That's why holiness matters, because your soul is priceless, and through it, God can bless countless lives. The world will tell you that holiness is outdated, impossible, or unnecessary. But the cross of Christ says otherwise. Holiness is not about living by man's standards, it's about living by Christ's presence. Elijah's prayer shows us that even in a land filled with compromise, one heart surrendered to God can shift the atmosphere. The same is true today. Your prayer, your faith, your surrender can open heaven over your life. And while perfection is out of reach, Christ's holiness in you is more than enough. He calls you not because you are flawless, but because your soul is his greatest treasure. When the rain finally fell, the people knew it was God who had answered. That's the beauty of holiness. It points back to him, not to us. Elijah wasn't glorified, God was. In the same way, when you walk in holiness, it's not about drawing attention to yourself, but about showing the world that Christ lives in you. And here's the truth, the rain is not the end of the story. Christ himself is the greater rain, the living water that satisfies eternally. He calls you today to guard your soul, to live set apart and to trust him fully. Holiness is his gift to you, and it's the mark of those who belong to him. After the rain, Elijah's heart must have felt both relief and awe, not because he had achieved something great, but because God had shown his faithfulness. This is how holiness works in us too. It brings us to a place where we see God's hand more clearly and recognize that every drop of grace flows from him. Christ doesn't ask for perfection but for surrender. He knows our weakness, yet still calls us to walk with him because our souls are his treasure. And when we allow his Spirit to shape us, holiness is not a burden but a joy, not a prison but freedom, because we are living as we were created to live, in communion with him. Think about your own journey for a moment. Maybe you've had seasons of drought, when prayers seemed unanswered, when your faith felt dry. Elijah's persistence in prayer is a reminder that even when nothing seems to change, God is working. The small cloud that appeared to his servant was just the beginning of a downpour. In your life too, the smallest sign of hope is proof that Christ has not abandoned you. He values your soul more than anything, and holiness is his way of protecting it, shaping it, and filling it with living water. Holiness is not the absence of struggle, it's the presence of Christ in the struggle. Holiness is deeply connected to love. It's not about rigid rules or rituals but about a heart captivated by Christ's love and willing to reflect it back to the world. Elijah stood against a culture that had abandoned God, not because he was strong in himself, but because his love for the Lord was greater than his fear of men. In the same way, Christ calls you to holiness because he desires that your love for him becomes greater than the pull of sin. When your soul rests in his love, holiness becomes less about striving and more about abiding, less about pressure and more about presence. Elijah's boldness in prayer was matched by his humility before God. That balance is the essence of holiness, a life both bold in faith and humble in surrender. When you kneel before Christ, you're acknowledging that he alone is Lord, and in that surrender, your soul finds peace. The holiness he asks of you is not perfection in action but devotion in heart. Your soul matters so deeply to him that he shed his blood to secure it, to cleanse it, and to guard it forever. Every step you take toward holiness is a step deeper into his embrace, where your soul is never forgotten. The rains in Elijah's day restored the land, but they also restored the people's faith in the living God. In the same way, holiness restores not just your soul but your testimony. People are watching, often silently, and when they see Christ's presence in you, it points them to him. That's why holiness matters in the everyday, in your kindness, your patience, your integrity. Christ shines through the details, through the unseen moments when you choose to honor him. Holiness is Christ's way of shaping your soul into a living testimony, a light in a world that desperately needs him. Holiness also equips us for service. Elijah's prayer didn't just bless him, it blessed an entire nation. Your pursuit of holiness isn't just about your soul, though your soul is priceless. It's also about the lives you touch. Christ calls his followers to care for the poor, the orphan, and the widow just as he did. Holiness moves us outward, making us vessels of his compassion. When you live set apart for him, you become a bridge for his love to flow to others. That's why holiness matters, not only for your soul's sake but for the sake of the world around you. If holiness feels impossible, remember this: Christ never called you to walk alone. He gave you his Spirit to empower you, his word to guide you, and his church to walk beside you. That's why it matters to be part of a community that truly preaches Christ and lives out his love in action. A church that feeds the hungry, cares for the needy, and reflects the compassion of Jesus is where holiness grows. Holiness is not a solo mission. It is a family journey, where your soul finds strength among brothers and sisters who walk the same path of grace. Christ cares about your soul more than anything because it is eternal. Everything else in your life, possessions, achievements, even struggles, will pass, but your soul will endure. That is why holiness is not optional, it is essential. It is Christ's way of preparing you for eternity, shaping you into his likeness so that you may dwell with him forever. Elijah's rain was temporary, but the living water Christ offers is eternal. When you walk in holiness, you're not just surviving the droughts of life, you're preparing for the eternal rain of his presence, where your soul will never thirst again. So as you listen to Elijah's story, don't just see it as history. See it as a mirror. Where in your life is God calling you to rebuild the altar, to surrender again, to pray until the cloud rises? Christ is calling you to holiness, not because he demands perfection but because he treasures your soul. Your soul is the jewel he came to redeem, and holiness is his way of polishing it until it shines with his light. Holiness is not about being flawless, it's about being faithful, and Christ himself will carry you when you feel weak. Today, let Elijah's prayer remind you that God still hears, Christ still calls, and holiness is still possible through him. Guard your soul because it is your greatest treasure. Walk with Christ daily, drink from his living water, and let your life be a testimony of his grace. If you want to grow deeper, open the scriptures daily, for they are the food of the soul. Find a church that truly preaches Christ and also lives his compassion through works of love and service, for this is the heart of the gospel. And as you walk in holiness, remember, your soul is safe in the hands of the one who loves you beyond measure.